is about 7,500 years ago. So it's just obvious, since there weren't written records for much of human history, it just stands to reason. The plant was everywhere, right? It grows easily everywhere, as you know. So it's probably been with us since long before they even called us Homo sapiens, the other species that, human-like species, Neanderthals and various ones, they must have found it. It must have been around. Anyway, they do think it's, kind of originated in, civilized use, if you will, in Asia, and gradually spread prior to the time of Christ, and then on into the Common Era, AD, into Europe, Africa, all those places. There's a pretty good indication. I'm not a historian, but this is just a quick survey just to give some context in advocating for the power and longevity of our plant, right? There's a lot of indication that the Delphic oracles from ancient Greeks were using cannabis. All the depictions show a lot of smoke. There's a pretty good indication that cannabis was part of that. Let's see now. Apparently, they think its arrival in the Americas is more recent, but I came upon some information that the Spanish found natives in Florida using cannabis when they arrived in 1530. So that suggests who knows how long they had that plant before that, right? And has been, and still is in certain quarters, used in actual quote-unquote religions like Chinese Taoism and shamanism, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Judaism, Islamic Sufis, Rastafarianism, somewhat more recently, of course, and many more. There's a book, I forgot the title of it, by Mike Marinacci, that goes through all the different cannabis cults and religions, mostly of the 20th century. Interesting book. And now I want to share with you just a little more, just to kind of rub it in, that our connection with this plant from the historical record. So just a short few little snippets of what I've called testimony from the record. This is from the Greater Lord of Long Life. Excuse me, Ben. The Greater Lord of Long Life from circa 300 BC. First a yin, then a yang. No one knows what I do. Jade buds of holy hemp for the one who lives apart. And this next one is possibly my all-time favorite quote about cannabis with its implications. It's from a Sufi poet named Fuseli, around about 1500 AD. And he said, hashish is the Sufi master himself. If you sit with that for a bit, I mean, I don't want to just elaborate on it much, but if you sat with that for a few minutes, just thought, what does that imply? It basically says that you can, in a sense, awaken or see God, so to speak, if you use this plant properly. And another favorite source of information, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Hemp Drugs Commission report of 1893-94. It was a massive report commissioned by the British government. They wanted to know, cannabis in various forms was, all but ubiquitous in India, and they wanted to know what the hell that was all about, and was it a problem? So they did this massive report, sent people around, did all these studies. It went on for a long time, a year or two, I'm not sure. And the conclusion was, no problem. No social harm with this plant, But my specific reason for referring to it here is there's an appendix in that report by a guy named J.M. Campbell, and he studied the spiritual use of it. And I just want to read you one quote from that appendix because it's really good. In the ecstasy of bhang, the spark of the eternal in man turns into light, the murkiness of matter or illusion, and the self is lost in the central soul fire. The devotee who drinks bhang partakes of the god Shiva. We drank bhang and the mystery I am he, meaning Shiva, grew plain, right? So that kind of sets the bar for what this plant is actually capable of. So when people don't think of cannabis as a psychedelic, in my opinion, wrong. You know, maybe it doesn't, as the scientists like our beloved Dennis McKenna might say, it doesn't impact the 5-HT2A receptor, but functionally, potentially, when it's used optimally, cannabis, actually, let me answer that a different way. Dennis's brother has a quote, "There is no doubt that," that's Canadian for doubt, by the way. And you haven't heard me say A yet either, have you? Yeah. There's no doubt that cannabis is trivialized as a commodity and is degraded by the designation recreational drug. But there is also no doubt that when used occasionally in a context of ritual and culturally reinforced expectation of a transformation of consciousness, cannabis is capable of nearly the full spectrum of psychedelic effects associated with hallucinogens. That's Terence McKenna. So the next section I want to get into is how can that be elicited, evoked? How can that be possible? You know, that cannabis can do that. And again, this is just sort of a simple few little points. There's a lot of other ways to talk about it, a lot of other kind of information that you can talk about with cannabis, but there's just kind of like a quick little survey, little stuff that I put together here. So it's a vasodilator, and one of the things that does is it allows more freshly oxygenated blood to flow through the whole system, okay? If you smoke, as opposed to taking it orally, at the very beginning, the heart rate speeds up a little. You've probably noticed that if you're a cannabis user. And again, it increases the pumping of that fresh blood into the brain, into the extremities, everywhere, you know. Probably a good explanation for why people tend to find music richer, right? It's a physical thing. It's a biochemical physical thing. So there's a deeper breathing that can happen, an expanding of the skeletal muscles so that the lungs can expand more. And yeah, like that. So another aspect of it is homeostatic balance. And cannabis potentially balances both the parasympathetic system, sometimes referred to as the rest and digest, and the sympathetic system, sometimes referred to as the fight or flight system, right? It kind of resolves those and balances them. Balances the flow to both sides of the brain. And then, I don't know, I've never heard this guy's name pronounced, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I just call him, I say it's Dr. Robert Melamed or Melamed or something like that. And he says, "We now know the endocannabinoids are critical homeostatic regulators of all body systems, and perhaps most importantly, of energy flow in general." In another quote somewhere else, he also says that, of society, okay? So, now on the more like mental, psychological, spiritual level, here's a couple of quick points as well. I like to think of cannabis, as other psychedelics are often referred to, as a non-specific or unspecific amplifier, okay? So that's, I think, a really interesting, handy way to conceptualize cannabis. Is like, then what do you do with that, right? It's like you're given this temporary gift of increased depth or amplification of experience, and how do you channel that? I think of her as a, there's reasons to call her, maybe I'll get into that a little later. I think of her as a very gracious ally, a flexible ally. You can misuse her, you can use her well, she will let you go whatever, because of the amplification function, whatever direction in a sense you're already pointing, she will take you further or allow you to go further. So whether that's negative or positive, you know. However, for the purposes of using cannabis as a spiritual ally, that energy, that temporary amplification, can be channeled into a deepening, awakened presence, okay? So another way of thinking about that is, which is, I don't know, almost unique among the psychedelics from my point of view, or from my understanding, is that the way that cannabis works as a spiritual assistant, so to speak, is that it's holistic. It works on the mind, the body, and the spirit simultaneously, okay? So it's an energy medicine. I even like to think of it as a reality medicine. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I was going to mention that one later. Now I want to get into actually making a couple of suggestions about practices, if this is your intention. You know, if your intention is to treat this plant as a sacred plant and use it for real spiritual growth. So here's a couple of little principles. Not an escape. You know, people use it that way, but as a spiritual, sacred sacrament, not escape, right? Is that too obvious? I don't know. It's actually, again, an entry into reality. You know, I'll give you a real brief anecdote. I hope I can get all this in. I was sitting on a beach in Seaside, Oregon, in the grass one evening, and I had a joint with me. And it was a beautiful evening. The sun was about to go down. I was about 100 yards, or as we say in Canada, 100 meters from the ocean. There was a soft breeze, perfect temperature, and I had maybe 2 puffs, and I just sat in silence. And I just immediately thought, this is not a drug. This is just a reality medicine. It didn't distort anything. It just made my heartfelt, in a sense, appreciation and love of that moment and that place that I was in right there then stronger. It deepened it. So like that, right? I'm going to get a little deeper into how to channel that. So the less distraction, the better, right? The less external distraction, in general. I mean, let's be honest, there's lots of different ways to use cannabis. I have no judgment about anybody who uses it that they're happy with, right? But for the kind of work that I'm talking about here today, the less distraction externally and internally, the more likely she will show up, or it will show up, and it can do its thing, so to speak, okay? So another way of saying that is noise blocks the signal, right? If you've got a bunch of conflicting noises, you can't hear the radio station properly, right? That's why users like Dennis and I, sorry Dennis, I'm actually a year older than him, so I can say that. I think I'm the oldest person here, you know. Anyway, the noise that we generate in our head blocks the signal, blocks the entrance, as it were, okay? Quieting that noise opens the channel, and by the way, can feel incredibly fucking good, right? Dennis said something last night about symbiotic relationship between plants and people. So I think that's a really important concept, that, you know, to start thinking of cannabis not as a consumer object, a consumer item, but as a relationship with a sacred plant. And you know, some of the people that have worked with this plant for a very long time say it actually takes a long time to really get to know that plant and maximize, so to speak, the efficiency of how you could use it for spiritual benefit. And one of those people, by the way, who's actually, I'm going to say, my favorite chapter in my Cannabis and Spirituality book is Kathleen Harrison, who happens to be the ex-wife of Terence McKenna, but quite brilliant ethnobotanist in the sense of in her own way, and she's talked about that issue. And one of the things she says, which I really like, I think this is right out of the book, one lesson cannabis can offer us is learning to be comfortable with the experience of crossing a threshold safely, back and forth, shifting into another way of perceiving and feeling. And then another little thought about that is that cannabis, and I know I'm mostly preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, but I'll say it anyway, it tends to unlock receptivity. You know, if you can kind of quiet and calm down and pay attention to whatever it is, you know, like You could sit in front of a flower, and don't just kind of look at it and go, oh, that's beautiful, and move on. You know, have a toke, sit in front of the flower, and just be with it for a while. You know, that can be a really amazing experience. We have a lot of plants in our garden. We have a lot of bees in our garden. I like to just watch bees sometimes. Bees, I'm totally in love with bees. So that was a few little principles that one might apply to working with cannabis as a spiritual ally. And now I'm going to make a couple of actual practice suggestions. So you could think of meditation practice as a range from more or less formless to increasing levels or degrees of form. In Buddhism, they call it the form-based stuff, they call one-pointed meditations. Okay, so that would be like visualization practices that Buddhists often do. Chanting can be that. And then you could extend the definition of spiritual practice beyond what might conventionally be thought to be that into things like making music, painting, listening to music, even dancing. I think the form-type practices are ideally involve less linear kind of thinking and more entrance into the moment. I think of cannabis as a nowness meditation. That amplification effect tends to deepen us into the moment, but not necessarily, I mean, or possibly somewhat at the cost of linear, continuous thinking in that sense. Maybe, depends on the person, but for the purposes of working with it in this way, there's this whole range from formless to, I'll go this way, from form to formless, and ending at formless, and not necessarily totally, completely formless, but the closer to that one can get, I think, for at least part of the time that you're spending time with this beautiful plant, is where its truest power shows up, okay? So one night I was sitting with cannabis, doing that, just meditating on a cushion, and thoughts come up, let them go, back to the breath, and I got this little download. It just said, enter me in silence. Like when you first have that toke, sit with it in silence and connect with the plant, right? You probably mostly know, how am I doing here?
You're good, you got like
lots of time. Most of you probably know Rumi, the wonderful Persian mystic poet from the 13th century, Middle East. He had a lot to say about quieting the mind, right? And so I got a couple of his here. Let silence take you to the core of life. Silence again meaning the quieting of the mind, right? Here's another one. All is known in the sacredness of silence. And here's another one. Silence is an ocean, speech is a river. When the ocean is searching for you, don't walk into the language of river. Listen to the ocean and bring your talky business to an end. Traditional words are just babbling in that presence, and babbling is a substitute for sight. A couple more points on practice. This is, 1,000 years or more of an immense body of Buddhist teaching brought down to about 25 words or less. So I'll call it kindergarten level Buddhist principle. The awakened state is our true nature. It's not a position, it's not a belief, it's not a dogma, it doesn't belong to any religion. It is every single person's true nature underneath all the trouble and turmoil. Okay? The ego, and let's not put too much on ego. This word is another word that people have all kinds of uses for, but from the Buddhist perspective, ego is the identification with a fictional self, in the sense that we created a set of beliefs and concepts from the moment we were born to help us survive and cope in the world, right? So all these things that we tell ourselves, like this is true, this is not true, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, all that stuff, right? Problem with the ego in that sense is that it's a bulwark against this opening. The strategies of ego, the concepts, the beliefs, and all that kind of ego identity stuff is an obstacle to simply surrendering and paying attention. Another Terence McKenna one, which I always really liked, I think he got it from somewhere else, but it's whistling past the graveyard. So the graveyard is the metaphor for egolessness, the notion of egolessness, of full presence, without all this overlay of conceptual belief systems, right? And the whistling past the graveyard part is like, oh no, I didn't see that. You know, I'm just going to keep on going here, right? That's what we're all doing to one degree or another, I submit. I'm certainly, you know, Exhibit A. Excuse me a second. Okay, hang on a second, lost my place here. Oh, okay, so here's just it's a super simple, like grossly oversimplified again, suggestion for practice. Almost formless. This is pretty much what Buddhist teachings call shamatha practice. Shamatha, Sanskrit word meaning dwelling in peace. So just sit with a straight spine, because energy moves better that way. Don't make a big deal about it. You don't have to get into full lotus, blah, 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 or any of that kind of stuff. It's not a holy act. It's just a practical thing to do. And then, excuse me, put a gentle attention on the breath, not a hyper focus on the breath. This is shamatha practice, you know, condensed. And then thoughts come up. This is a really interesting thing, right? You can't stop the thoughts from coming up, and you don't want to do that. But for the purpose of entering the gateway, as it were, it's the gap, it's that silence place in between that we want to hopefully allow to open up more for ourselves, right? So thoughts come up, no praise, no blame to the content of whatever that thought is. With cannabis, you might think it's the most brilliant thought anyone has ever had, right? Or it could be the opposite. It could be paranoid. It could be self-sabotaging. But when you're sitting, with or without cannabis, basically no praise, no blame, and just allow the thought to dissipate like the vapor, the cloud that it actually is, and come back to this gentle attention on the breath. So there's like what would normally be at least a half an hour meditation instruction brought down to 1 minute, okay? So, on this notion of surrendering into the space with the amplification assistance of cannabis, I want to quote David R. Loy, who's a Buddhist scholar, wrote some really interesting books, and this is what he says, or one of the many things he says. Instead of being a constant anxiety that haunts me, the nothingness at my core turns out to be my freedom to be this, to do that. This liberation reveals my true nature to be formless. Okay? So, next little thing I want to get into is a couple of brief thoughts on cannabis as a supporter of other sacramental medicines. Cannabis used skillfully can strengthen, clarify, and even smooth the effects of other psychedelics in conjunction with them. Some people like to use cannabis just as the psilocybin effect is coming on, because they find it smooths the entry into it more. Because oftentimes that early part, you know, in that sort of first half hour to an hour can be, yeah, people are nodding their heads, yeah, I know that one. Can be kind of jagged or anxiety-inducing and stuff like that. Some people find, it's just ideas, don't, you know, not authoritative, just, you know, you can try it if you want, may smooth the entry in. But then there's this other way, where once the other medicine is fully kicked in, and this is, I would say, advanced spiritual practice, like something to be really careful with, because cannabis can seriously potentiate the effect of that other medicine. Again, Terence McKenna said in one of his tapes or books or whatever, he said when he took mushrooms, he liked, I forget when, like maybe an hour and a half later, he'd smoke some cannabis, and he said it tended to synergize and prolong the visions experienced with psilocybin. One of the people that I have as a chapter in my cannabis book is Mariano da Silva, who's ayahuasca shaman, expert leader, etc., ceremonial leader. And in his tradition, they also work with cannabis, or what they call Santa Maria. And he said sometimes, and he would only do this with a really experienced group, not newbies to their ceremonies, because it's really powerful. He said they'll have their first drink of ayahuasca, and they'll sing hymns, and then have a silent sitting for a while. Then they'll have their second drink of ayahuasca, like an hour and a half later or whatever. And after that, they will sometimes smoke some cannabis. And what he said was that the ayahuasca takes you to the top of the mountain, and the cannabis, or Santa Maria, gives you wings to take off and fly in the wind. So obviously we're talking, strong potential here. I've personally experienced it a little bit, and one time on a kind of a modest psilocybin dose where I could actually hike in a beautiful area outside of Vancouver on a beautiful sunny day, and I had a couple of tokes, and it just immediately, in my way of saying it, doubled the effect of the psilocybin, okay? I know how I want to say a little bit about dosage and strains, because they're important, or cultivars as some people like to call them, or chemovars as some other people like to call them. Dosage is really fucking important. I have a little phrase. The optimal dosage for this kind of work, at least, is the dosage that you both want to and can handle. The want to is you want just a nice light toke to give a slight amplification and settling and calmness to your meditation, or do you want to go for the deep, get into the deep end of the pool. So that bleeds into the can handle part, because a lot of people, probably most of the people in this room, have had experiences even with inhaled cannabis, let alone orally ingested cannabis, where it's too much. And you have a whole range of symptoms or experiences at that point: nausea, dizziness, confusion, anxiety, paranoia, all those things can happen if you have too much. So the beauty of this plant is that we can experiment endlessly with it, right? So there's a saying, start low and go slow. So especially with a new strain that you haven't tried before, we got lots of time, we got our lives, right? Start real slow, just have like a half-size toke or something, and just sit with it for 10 minutes or whatever, and see how that feels, right? There's no there. And this is, I think, a key point about cannabis as a spiritual ally, and maybe just spirituality altogether, is it's not about getting somewhere else in a sense, right? It's about deepening into what's already here, into this now moment, calming, relaxing, opening our hearts, all that. It's all right here. So cannabis, as I mentioned earlier, has this potential to be a reality medicine that just helps us enter into that space more. You've heard the term less is more. That can be quite useful, right? And then other times, more is more. And again, that comes into, can you handle it, right? Can you stay present? Can you keep calm enough that your thoughts aren't going crazy and filling up all the space, etc., right? How are we doing for time?
In 2 minutes, you'll have 10 minutes.
How many?
In 2 minutes, you'll have 10 minutes.
I got 12 minutes, thank you.
I was checking his math skills.
So, you noticed in the quote from the India Hemp Drugs Commission report that they were referring to bong and he who drinks bong, right? So as many of you know, when you take it orally, it can be a lot more powerful and, of course, much longer lasting. So that's an interesting area of exploration for some of this deeper work as well. And so now strains. In my personal experience, only a minority of the cultivars I've encountered in a long history, 50 years of using this plant or more, have what I now would call the force, or the spiritual force. In the Santo Daime ayahuasca religion with the ayahuasca, they'll say, if you're not experiencing the force, have more, right? So this comes into can you handle, right? The term or the word or phrase in Portuguese is a força, okay? So I'm really picky about cannabis I will smoke. I will try something, but if I don't know its provenance, if I don't know anything about it, who grew it or anything, ideally it might be nice if it's organic. The whole notion of lovingly growing the plants, I don't know if there's any good science to prove it, but there's certainly a lot of people that claim it makes a difference to the end user. Also in the cannabis book, there's a guy who's a grower. I put a chapter in there. I got a guy to write about his growing, and he said that's how he treats his cannabis. He uses filtered water. He goes around singing to them and just, I love you, and he says that when he shares his cannabis with people, or they have experiences cannabis, they go, holy shit, I've never experienced cannabis like this, right? So that's a claim that the grower and the attitude of the grower can potentially make a big difference, all right? So, since I still have 9 minutes and 37 seconds left, or so, I thought I'd get into this one. I didn't know if I was going to have time for this one, but the question is, does cannabis have a spirit? Some of you are going to go, well, duh, of course it does. Others are going, no, I don't know if there's any proof for that. I can't personally prove that it exactly has a spirit. I certainly feel like I've downloaded a lot of information in the cannabis state. And, there's kind of almost like a joke, oh yeah, you think it was great while you were high, and then the next day it looks banal or ridiculous, right? But, you have to call, as the great bard and poet and cannabis lover and Buddhist Allen Ginsberg once said, if you write stoned, edit sober, right? But that still means you can often come back with a lot of gems, right? This is something I wrote in my journal one night. I had a flash one night in her embrace as if she was speaking to me. The message was that she wants us to heal. She wants us to be free. She wants to see our hearts awaken. She wants us to receive the full effects of her beautiful gift, and she needs our attention for that to happen. She requires us to surrender to her. So here's another sweet story about cannabis spirit. I've heard different versions of this story. This is the first one I heard. I've heard other versions. A fellow who was like a lineage holder in the Santo Daime ayahuasca religion named Padrino Sebastião. Padrino was like an honorific. Had a community in the jungle called Serra da Mapia, I think, anyway, in Brazil. And back in the 70s, some hippie showed up with some cannabis at his compound and was sort of embarrassed, like, this is a religious ayahuasca using community. I got this stuff, like, what should I do with it, Padrino? And he said, well, give it to me and I'll check it out. So he smoked it on his own, and he had a vision of being in a garden with a woman. And she said, oh, hey, welcome, you're in my garden. And that plant you smoked, that's my plant. So because it was a syncretic religion, combining Christianity and indigenous traditions, etc., he called her Santa Maria, Saint Mary. So that's how it got called Santa Maria. And she said, by the way, I'm going to charge you with the responsibility of teaching people how to use this plant as a sacred plant, not, with disrespect, okay? Another one from Kathleen Harrison. She met a lot of indigenous people from the Amazonian regions in her life, and she said that they say every plant has a mother, the original embedded essence of the species, the conscious, timeless being that holds the form and transmits the medicine and teachings of the plant. Okay, I got a couple more, but I'm going to skip them because I quickly want to mention a possible couple of sidetracks and cautions. The shiny thoughts thing that I mentioned a moment ago can bleed into ego's attempt to protect our identity by obscuring and creating noise. So you might watch out for these shiny thoughts. I mentioned overdosing as a potential and the kind of symptoms that you can have with that. And here's a couple of quick suggestions that I've picked up. I've never used any of these, but I've read about them in case you can't. Ideally, when you get into that state where you feel like you've had too much, especially when it's been smoked, I've experienced this a lot in my cannabis ceremonies. You can often work with that. Keep breathing, don't buy into the narrative, maybe lie down for a few minutes and then you can get back up and keep going. Okay, but if you really can't deal with it, with an overdose, so to speak, sugary foods can help. Food in general. Some people say chewing or sniffing black peppercorns. Inhaled CBD can help. Fresh air, quiet, safe place, lie down, breathe, don't buy the thoughts, okay? I didn't save myself enough time to do justice to this. Oh, yes, oh, shit. I wish I had more time. Can I have extra 5 minutes, Tom? No, I can't. The dependency issue. You know, you can think like you have to do everything on cannabis, right? And then the rest of your life feels drab, but that's a dangerous direction to go for a lot of people. And there's a significant tolerance and diminishing returns effect when you do that as well. It's really tricky. Cannabis can get a hold of you rather than you controlling your use of cannabis. And you think you need it, and you think it's fine, but it could be a problem, and it often is. Kathleen Harrison said a lot of people don't even want to come out of the sort of the man cave into the daylight world of responsibility and engagement, especially younger, in her experience, younger males. I was going to do this other little section about how cannabis, because of its safety and efficacy and universal availability and gentle, unique, but also powerful style, can be the sacrament of peace for the universal religion, the non-dogmatic, non-hierarchical religion of the future. So I wanted to throw that in super briefly, because I still need 3 minutes or more to tell you a little bit about the cannabis ceremony tonight, so you know what you're in for if you come to that, okay? This is a cannabis meditation ceremony. So if the idea of sitting in your chair straight for about 1.25 hours to 1.5 hours, doing 3 or 4 minutes of silent meditation mixed with some sound journeying. I have crystal bowls and a few other things that I use, and then back to the silence and just going back and forth like that, in silence, without a single word being said by anyone throughout the whole 1.25 hours. Actually, what we're going to do is Tom has some gracious friend or friends that supplied some pre-rolls. And so I'm going to start it as a ceremony with a gong, and then I'm going to ask, maybe I'll lead you, or maybe even I can get Tom to lead you or something, lead you out there, and then I'm going to ask you to share these joints in silence. It's a ceremony. It's like being at a meditation ceremony, right? You don't sit there with 100 other people in your, what do you call it, Vipassana, session, and, suddenly go, hey, I just want to tell you about my experience, right? This is 1.25 hours, 1.5 hours or so of silent sitting, and same out here, please, and if you're coming to that, and then we'll lead you back in, sit down, and do the things that I just mentioned, okay? So if that doesn't suit your style, if you're not interested in that, you probably wouldn't like doing this, but if you're up for that, I'll be doing that after the dinner break tonight. Thanks, folks.